A small Cambridge inn called the White Horse. The Reformation came.
Restless is raw, unscripted, reformed radio.
Welcome back to Restless. This is Pastor Michael, and I'm joined by Matt, but not the Matt that hosts the show. A different Matthew today, but if you're a longtime listener of the show, this won't be the first time that you've met him. Today, we're going to be talking about the ecumenical councils, and so I have an expert with me in Matthew Hoskin. So, Matt, do you prefer Matthew or Matt?
I prefer Matthew, but I don't dislike Matt. So if you're comfortable calling me Matt, keep on doing it.
I may accidentally, because I always record with Matt, but I will try to call you Matthew. As somebody who prefers Michael as opposed to Mike, I will try to call you Matthew. But Matthew, welcome back to Restless.
Yeah, it's good to be back on.
Yeah, we were just reminiscing that the last time we had you on to talk about the Desert Fathers. Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll get into that a little, as I've just taught my church Sunday school a little bit about Anthony of the Desert and some of his influence, especially on St. Athanasius. But that's not the main reason that we're having you on today. What we're doing today, ideally, is we wanted to bring somebody on to talk about the first seven ecumenical church councils, the seven. And we thought you were probably the best person that we know at all to do it. Maybe the best person there is. I
wouldn't be so bold. Probably the best person living is probably Richard Price, who translated the official acts of all of the ones that survive at this point.
Wow.
That guy, no matter how good I get, he will. But
he always gets it. Yeah, well, why don't you give us just a quick rundown for those who don't remember you from before, weren't listening at that point, and haven't done what you should do with all podcasts, which is go to the beginning and listen to everything. Why don't you just let everybody know who you are, what you do, why you would come on a show like this to talk about such a topic?
All right, for sure. Thanks. Yeah. So I am professor of church history, or Christian history, I think we officially call it actually, at Davenant Hall, which is the teaching wing of the Davenant Institute, which hopefully your listeners have heard of. We are committed to retrieving, originally we were specifically classical Protestant wisdom, then guys like me joined who do patristics, and which actually, if you know about classical Protestant wisdom, that fits perfectly. If you've read Vermigli or Cranmer or Calvin or Luther, you see these guys are deep in the fathers as well. So my own specialization as a professor for Davenant is patristics. I also do medieval. So patristic is sort of like ancient, but verging into early medieval church history, sort of those centuries that laid the groundwork for all the rest of our dogma and theology, and then the canonical structures that persisted until the Reformation, which maybe we'll get into that. I don't know. Just think about J. Dwyer in some of his comments from recent episodes where you're doing your reactions to him. So that's sort of, I teach for that, and I have upcoming a course on the seven so-called ecumenical councils of the ancient church that begin with the First Council of Nicaea, which is the most famous of them. It's the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea. Yeah. So I thought this would be a good year to offer that course so people can sort of see Nicaea and its legacy over those centuries.
Yes, I should be saddened by this maybe, but I forgot it was the anniversary. I knew that it was, especially because of all of the, extra things going on, right? All the extra conferences and things going on. Even, in Wisconsin, there's obviously a huge Catholic presence, and there's a lot going on around. A lot of my Roman Catholic friends are, inviting me to all kinds of conferences and celebrations. And so this is our celebration. Bringing you on, we get to enjoy that together in this way. And so as we get started, let's assume that me and the listeners really don't know what you meant when you just said the Seven Ecumenical Councils. Could you just give us a very brief rundown? And I'm kind of just setting this up because you had a great tweet that you put out recently that just ran through these really quick, when they were, what they were about. Would you be willing to do that for us?
I would gladly do that. So my most popular tweet ever, which I was saying to Michael, means I'm not that big on Twitter because it only got like 360 likes. So in the grand scheme of things, I'm a drop in the ocean.
I don't think I've ever had anything like that, by the way.
I
did
surprised.
a bunch of posts about baptism once that somehow got much outside of the small little circle that I have things in. But I don't think it got near that. So you're the big time now.
I'm in the big time. So here's my quick and dirty list of 7 ecumenical councils. And then after this, I'll actually explain what makes it, why these 7, perhaps what is ecumenical. So, but these are the 7 things that I'm going to be teaching on this course. This is the standard list that people use. So 1, Nicaea in 325, Jesus is God. Second council is Constantinople in First Constantinople 381, for real this time. If you do 4th century ecclesiastical history, you'll understand. You also, of course, from my course, you would understand that. For real, Jesus is God. Number 3, Ephesus in 431, Jesus is God and man. Therefore, you can say Mary is the God-bearer. Number 4, Chalcedon in 451, Jesus is God and man, 2 natures and 1 person. Number 5, Second Constantinople in 553, that 1 person part is very important. Number 6 is Constantinople 3, 689. Jesus has 2 wills, though. And then number 7, Second Nicaea 787, which rules that since he's a man, you can make pictures of Jesus, and since he's God, you should kiss them. I didn't actually put the "you should" part when I made the tweet. I just said since he's God, kiss them as the imperative. So that is the 7 ecumenical councils of the ancient church.
Yeah. Now I notice that you keep using ecumenical in a way that sounds like you're putting quotations around it in some form. Are you really doing that, or am I just hearing that?
So that's a great question. I sort of am doing that simply because the definition of ecumenical is that originally these are councils for the oikumene, which is the entire populated world, which usually actually in practice, when it's used in any late Roman context, means the Roman Empire. However, it is true that bishops from outside the Roman Empire came. They came mostly from what was then the Persian Empire. I don't think anyone ever made it up from Ethiopia, where there were also Christians outside of the Roman Empire. And so, but the idea is these are councils for all of the everybody, as opposed to the modern use of ecumenical, which means it's Christians of different denominations who aren't in communion with one another, getting together, forming committees, making joint statements on justification that are, people think are interesting.
Yes.
And sort of, doing that. So whereas these ones they're meant to be for the whole church. The reason why I'm putting quotations around is partly because it's therefore not ecumenical in the sort of modern 20th century World Council of Churches sense of ecumenical, but also because there are only 2 of them that actually got the assent of the entire ancient church, which are the first 2. So Nicaea and First Constantinople, that established for us the doctrine of the Trinity, are the only ones that got universal assent, because the guys outside the Roman Empire in Persia actually rejected the Council of Ephesus and therefore everything that follows. And then the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church, and therefore also the Eritrean Orthodox Church, who weren't a separate thing back then, they would have all been one. They rejected the Council of Chalcedon, their 5th council, and everything that comes after it. Because if you reject one of them, because the councils all build on each other, you don't accept the later ones. Because every single council, like these are an actual series of events that are looking at each other. They all have at some point in their declaration, we believe the following things, and then they list the doctrinal statements of the previous councils, and they say, therefore, or following in the footsteps of the ancient fathers, we now say this, sort of to show they're not innovating. but it also sort of keeps those other guys from being able to sign on.
Now, what you've just said is really fascinating, and it may actually come as a shock to some people that are listening, because very often you hear from, maybe you could say, pop apologists of certain traditions, that there is a kind of unity that was true in the early church and in the councils, that was clear, obvious, and therefore it leads to whatever their tradition is, right? I mean, obviously it's always different. Different people say this, but you've just mentioned that there are actually those who disagreed even at the time with some of these. Could you go into that just a little bit more? How can that be? I thought they were all one and everybody agreed.
Yeah, so let's take, for example, the people who reject everything from the Third Council of Ephesus onwards. This is a group called the Church of the East, also sometimes called the Assyrian Church of the East. It exists today a little, its heartland is Iraq, and their metropolitan lived in a city that is not called Nineveh anymore, Mosul, and he lived in Nineveh. It's not, anyway.
I didn't know that Mosul and Nineveh are the same place.
They're like, if they're not the same place, they're like right next to each other, and Nineveh's like the ancient city,
Okay.
and the modern city's Mosul. Like there are
Right.
a lot of
They're
places like that in the Middle
right?
East.
Yeah, that's so. I love this, by the way. I love learning the ancient names and connecting them to the modern places, because when you say Mosul, I'm like, I don't know anything about that or where it is. When you say Nineveh, right, I'm like, I could point that out on certain maps, right? Like yeah. That's actually pretty cool. Anyway, sorry to cut in there.
So, yeah. So these guys, the thing about these guys is these guys, and they also, a lot of them are actually in India. And they actually were used as the liturgical language up until Western missionaries turned up. They actually used the Syriac language even in India, even though everyone there was speaking, some relative of Sanskrit or Hindi or something.
Fascinating.
Fascinating stuff. These liturgical languages that get frozen in every tradition at some point in its history. That's a different polemic we could have a different time. So these guys are there, but they've always been outside of the Roman Empire. And so it's true, we think it's true that there were a few guys from Persia who did come from the Persian Empire, which could be Iraq, it could be Western Syria, could be farther afield, Mesopotamia somewhere, which parts of which are in the Roman Empire anyway. And so it seems likely that some of them came to Nicaea, but this entire group of churches that are all sort of united together and at one point stretched as far as Beijing, they weren't sort of bound by the Council of Nicaea the way the churches within the Roman Empire were. And so they never actually fully came to an affirmation of it until the 400s. So it's partly just the accident of history for the Church of the East that they are, because of the politics and how hot politics between Persia and Rome were for so much of their early history, these churches were basically operating on their own. Whereas we in the Western Church, who are descended from the Church of the Roman Empire, I mean, even if you're like a Swedish Lutheran, you can trace the missionaries back to guys from ancient Rome, right? We don't realize that. We just sort of think, yeah, Nicaea for the whole church. Everyone agrees with that. Well, not everyone was there. Not everyone even knew about it, because they're like off being missionaries in Central Asia somewhere, in Afghanistan, preaching the gospel. They don't know there's some council meeting in Turkey, right? Yes. The distances are huge in the ancient world.
This is so interesting, by the way, to think about this time, because it's very hard for us to go back. You and I are talking from great distance with each other, and people from literally all over the world are going to listen to it as soon as this comes out. To think about the nature of communication, the nature of how the church remains in contact with one another, and as you're saying, there could be historical circumstances that actually cut some people off from others, and so you're developing from a different point, right? Maybe there's a connection at one point, but there's this development that is inevitable because of historical factors that might look different because you don't have that conversation going between you. That I don't have anything to say about that. I just think it's an interesting fact of history when you're studying these things.
Yeah. And what's interesting about the Church of the East then is we say, well, why did they not accept from Ephesus onwards? They actually, because they don't have Roman emperors telling them which council to accept, the bishops of the Church of the East are getting all this stuff later on, and they're evaluating it on their own terms. But what they do have to worry about is the Persian court. And then after that, the caliphate. And who is the number one enemy of the Persian court and the caliphate is Imperial Rome. And so whatever Rome is choosing, if the Church of the East goes with that, when there starts being questions and options available to you in the 5th century, those bishops start getting pressure put on them by the secular authorities to switch their allegiance as to which side they choose from the Roman Empire to the guys who aren't being supported by the Roman Emperor, but the other guys. And so there's this big exile of Church of these guys who go to Georgia. And that's why Georgia accepts all 7 of these councils, even though it's right next door to a geographical region that does not, because the Catholicos, he's like an archbishop for the region, got exiled to there with all of the clergy who accepted the council by the Persian Empire before the caliphate came and just sort of conquered everything. So it's crazy to think about that, just the distances and the way your church history works out differently when you have a different relationship with a secular authority. So that's the one group. The other group who rejected are these people I listed: Copts, Armenians, Ethiopians, the Syrian Orthodox. We're not the only Orthodox in the Syrian region, but that's what they're called, or sometimes they call themselves Syriac Orthodox after the language as opposed to after the ethnic group. So, they are the guys who they love Ephesus, the Saint Cyril of Alexandria, who's like a brilliant theologian, extraordinary mind, and they feel that the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which is the one that says he exists in 2 natures, they're like, that's too far, that's too much like our chief theological opponent, who's this guy Nestorius, who said that there are 2 persons. They argue that if there are 2 natures, there have to be 2 persons, that a nature always needs to have a trying to find a normal person way of saying this, a hypostatic existence. It needs to have its own instantiation of reality. And so then there cannot be one person with 2 natures. That's a logical impossibility. And so they say that the Council of Chalcedon, in saying there are 2 natures, it's either the heresy of Nestorius or just logically incoherent. And so they reject it on those grounds. But that means that that's a schism that is bubbling up during the 5th century, right? So we're 600 years before the so-called Great Schism, which most of us think of in 1054 as being the first real schism of the church, right? We're 600 years before that, and the Eastern Church is already fracturing over an ecumenical council.
It's so fascinating. This is a speculative question, because those are the kind of questions I enjoy a lot. But as you look at these things and think about them, how much do you think that culture and language difference played into the disagreements in these early centuries and in the early councils, as opposed to actual theological or biblical interpretation reasons? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that plays into it to a certain degree. So to stick to one that everyone ends up agreeing on, part of the reason why there was a struggle for acceptance of Nicaea, for example, is over the word homoousios, which means consubstantial, of one essence or of one substance, depending on what English word, how you get your Greek into Latin into English. And Athanasius, who, Pastor Michael, big fan, we should all be Athanasius maxing. He's a big homoousios guy, and this is his word. But there are other people who would agree with the content of his teaching who would reject that word. And so what they're actually doing over those decades, besides fighting with Roman emperors about it, when the bishops are talking to each other, there are groups of them who are learning that they actually teach the same thing about who God is. They're just finding different words for it. So they have to come to a common agreement about what those words mean. And that's why it takes really from let's say the real argument begins with the death of Constantine, because you can't really argue while he's around. So 337 to 381 is this 44-year period where the Orthodox bishops are sorting out what they mean and is homoousios the best word, and then coming to agreement it is, and then being able to put that forward at the council in Constantinople. in the Second Ecumenical Council, right? So there is this language question. And some people say, and people, in the life of Calvin, people got after Calvin for this. Well, then why are we using these philosophy words instead of using good, solid Bible words? Because you're trying to understand what the Bible means. Right. And so what you're trying to do is find what you might think of as neutral ground between disputed parties, so you can figure out how different people are interpreting different passages of Scripture. And if you start reading the works of Athanasius, like we're all big fans of On the Incarnation. If you start reading his works against the Arians, there you start getting some really deep exegesis of Scripture, going into passages here and there that they've been deploying against the Nicene side and showing how the actual true scriptural doctrine is that Jesus is fully God, the same way the Father is, and therefore, since there's only one God, they must be consubstantial. So there is that element, and so that rears its head every time there's a dispute, and sometimes they can't come to that agreement. And I think maybe it is, I think that there are times when it is because they actually do ultimately have a deep philosophical divide. I think in Greek, I know a lot of people have sympathy for Nestorius. So Nestorius is the guy who says there are two persons who are hitched together. I think I'm going to be naughty here, I'm going to say Nestorius is a heretic. And if you, in the Greek language, agree with Nestorius, you are embracing heresy. But I'm willing to say, in Syriac, the subtleties might be different. And that guys like Babai the Great and these other guys who support the teaching of Nestorius in the Syriac language, I don't know enough to know whether those guys are heretics or not, because the language changes as soon as it crosses from Greek into Syriac, if that makes sense. If I'm allowed to be both hard and wiggly at the same time.
I love it. Hot takes on the Syriac understanding of Nestorius is is what we're all about today. Fascinating. I just always think about that, and it's probably wrong to spend too much time thinking about, because there's only so far you can go with it, right? There's only so much we can say. Yep, clearly, like you're saying, there are examples where you see a difference in how to actually translate this and work it out together versus other times. Now, before we get into maybe, a few maybe more specific questions about the different councils, I have a question that I'm not exactly sure how to form it in the best way. And so maybe you can help me as we go. But and it's probably different depending on the council we're talking about in some part. But how did those involved in the council see the authority of what they were doing? And not just did they have the authority to do this, but the question of authority of, on the one hand, creeds, statements that come from the council, and on the other hand, the rest of the things that went on, right? The rest of the debate and the teaching and the canons and everything involved. How would they see the authority of what they were doing?
So, for, let's say, most of these councils saw themselves as being ecumenical councils. There's a strong chance that First Constantinople didn't, but its teaching got accepted everywhere, and it got embraced as an ecumenical council, starting with Ephesus. So whatever, no one disagrees with it. So that's a weird historical point to make. Right. But in terms of how do they view themselves, at that one they might not view themselves this way. But at the others, even Nicaea, which some people, because people want to reject the idea that there was a widespread belief that Jesus was fully God, you will find modern historians who try to say at Nicaea they were just trying to settle Arianism and move on, that they didn't necessarily believe anything, they didn't necessarily appeal to the authority of the council for most of the 4th century, all that sort of thing. Actually, pretty much from the get-go, people refer to it as the Great Council. And there were other councils that were very similar to it in other respects, summoned by the Emperor Constantine to deal with schisms and all these things that Nicaea also dealt with, that he did in the West, that no one refers to the Council of Arles in 314 as being the Great Council, right? It was a local council the emperor called to deal with a schism, right? And no one talks about any of the other important councils of the 4th century that in that same way, even when they accept the canon law that comes out of them. There's a whole list that I won't get to because That's just a guy listing names of cities in Asia Minor.
Yeah.
But all those councils, people actually accept that canon law in the ancient church, but they don't think of those as the Great Council. But Nicaea, sort of from the moment it's done, everyone acknowledges that this council has a special authority. And I think it's because of the combination of imperial favor, which is a thing. You always have to deal with the secular magistrate. We're magisterial Protestants here in the room, so we're all okay with this idea.
I was calling the civil magistrates in my county today to ask them questions about what I have the authority to do in certain questions about marriage. And so we submit to the magistrate.
So you have that, but also it is because it was trying to get together everybody. It was actually trying to be ecumenical. Like Constantine wanted everyone there to deal with this doctrinal issue in particular. And then also, which was tearing apart, partly because, to be a little bit disjointed, one of the reasons why is Arianism is tearing apart more than just Alexandria by the time Nicaea comes. If it had been able to have been contained in the early 420s without spreading into, it didn't spread, without it being realized there are people who agree with Arius throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, there wouldn't have been a need for an ecumenical council. But once you realize that the Bishop of Nicomedia, way up in Turkey, modern Turkey, is a supporter of Arius, then you realize this has to be bigger than local council to deal with the doctrinal problem. And then the other main canon law problem that they had was settling the date of Easter, which is still a kerfuffle to this day, but they tried. They gave it a good level try to settle the date of Easter.
Yes.
And so then they have that going on as another sort of thing that's a problem for the whole church everywhere.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, they view it as ecumenical, and the other ones do too. And so in terms of the authority, they see themselves, they see that the official dogmatic statements, which will be sent out in letters from the council, as having sort of this binding authority upon the rest of the churches, on the grounds that bishops met in council under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Like, they see themselves as being following in the footsteps of the apostles in Acts. Yep. At the Jerusalem Council there. That's what these other councils see themselves as doing.
Right.
And so they're meeting under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. They're coming to an agreement upon a matter of faith that touches the entire church. And so there is an expectation that the council, and what later they call the council fathers, have a special authority that everyone else is going to follow. And usually they do. They're like 5 guys who get kicked out of the Council of Nicaea for not signing. But generally, everyone at the council, maybe because imperial commissioners have rigged it. Let's be honest, the human element of these things is messy, right? But people do end up accepting it or getting excommunicated, basically. But then the guys who aren't there will get sent copies. And they usually sign off on it. It's very rare that, your local bishop in Aquileia, oh no, there's one that he rejected. Wait, no, it's very rare that your local bishop in Toledo in Spain gets his copy, not the Toledo in the States, gets his copy.
That's right. The Bishop of Ohio. And,
the Bishop of Ohio. He's like, hey, it's not as though the Bishop of Toledo in Spain gets his copy of the doctrinal statement of a council and rejects it. They're always like, yep, looks good to me. And then when there is a bit of dispute, you'll just get the emperor write another letter and say, hey guys, seriously, what do you guys think about this? And usually you come up with an almost universal consensus, even over something as fractious as the Council of Chalcedon, where all these guys are saying 2 natures equals 2 persons, so this is heresy or lunacy or foolishness.
Yeah.
Right. So they see themselves as having authority, and they think they claim that authority for canon law as well. Yeah. So
is there any difference that they see between those? I just don't know. I'm just interested to know, only because it seems as though there's a distinction, right? Here's the statement. Here are these other things that we agreed on. Now, I don't, not to say that those are, completely differentiated, but I'm just interested if you have any thoughts on that.
In my mind, there is a distinctive hierarchy between these things, because the synodal letters that get sent out afterwards are usually the dogmatic decree. If they deal with any canon law matters, it'll be something huge that everybody was upset about, like schism in Alexandria. There will be a special they deal with that by name at the Council of Nicaea, right? There's this group called the Meletians. But then other guys like the Paulianists, they're not mentioned in the synodal letter, but they're mentioned in the canons. So I think the canon law it gets accepted throughout the whole imperial church as being binding for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't think it is ever held in the same regard, because I think there's always this idea. An Orthodox priest once said to me, the canons are not canons, right? Like cannons with two ends in the middle. Like they're not there to blow people away, right?
Yes.
They're there for the orderly governance of the church.
Right.
And so then a lot of canons, like if you're people like, oh, does your church follow the canons of Nicaea? I'm like, I don't sit around thinking about the ranking of authority of the Bishop of Rome versus the Bishop of Alexandria anymore. Like Canon 6 of Nicaea doesn't affect my church, because we determined the Bishop of Rome has no authority in England, and we're an extension of that now.
Right.
So, or if you're a Presbyterian, you just don't have bishops. So a whole lot of the canons of Nicaea, you're like, no, sorry guys. Whereas I as an Anglican, I'm like, but then I as an Anglican, if I realize that Orthobros, we're not necessarily going there yet in the podcast,
right?
But I realize these guys we're not usually who they have in mind.
Yes.
When they make these statements, because I'm like, actually, most of the canons of Nicaea about bishops, if you happen to have bishops, are a good idea. They're about if a guy's gone straight from a secular career, he can't jump the queue. He needs to go through all the same process as someone else, no matter if it's St. Ambrose. This is the other thing. I just named a famous saint from after the Canon of Nicaea who broke the canons, and nobody minds, right? They're like, so he's a solid Nicene candidate for the Episcopate of Milan, friends. He's not even baptized when they elect him bishop. He's a catechumen who is a civil magistrate. A lot of magistrates in the Roman Empire delay baptism because part of their job involves not killing people yourself, but sentencing them to death. And they felt that there'd be too much blood on your hands, and so they wouldn't feel worthy for receiving Holy Communion and things. So that's why guys like Constantine and the Emperor Theodosius actually delayed their baptism. It's not because they were like crypto pagans or something dumb Da Vinci Code type stuff.
Yeah.
I think there were other pastoral issues that could have been addressed with guys like this, but that's why. And so Ambrose hasn't got baptized yet, even though he's a Christian. So he has to get baptized, and then he has to go through deacon, priest, bishop to become Bishop of Milan, which is one of the most powerful in the Western Church. Right, so people are breaking these canons within decades of everyone saying, yes, this is an authoritative council for us all.
Yes, it's fascinating. I love that, by the way. And there obviously in practice, there's that difference between dogmatic statements and, hey, this is how we're working these things out in the church, and pastoral care and things like that. I will correct one thing you said, by the way, that, as a Presbyterian, we don't have bishops. No, I'm the bishop.
I remember you and Matt saying that.
This is Matt. Matt taught me to say this. I'm going to start using it now. I'm the bishop.
Well, then the canons of Nicaea about the worthiness of the bishop are as applicable to a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church as they are to a bishop in the Anglican Church. So.
That's right. That's right. Can you tell us a bit about, post-Nicaea, some form of Arianism clearly still is massive. I don't know. You can tell me if this is true or not. I had one church history professor who was a patristics guy, who, if I could be misremembering, but if I remember right, he said even after Nicaea, there was a point where large portions, if not a majority of at least certain regions, would be considered Arian in some form, right? Before these things really took hold. Now, obviously that changes over time, but how influential was Arianism?
So Arianism is hugely influential throughout the 4th century.
Well, I'm going to jump in really quick. Can you define Arianism for us? How, Nicaea, you gave us, Jesus is God, but, what was Arianism? And then get back right to it.
So this is great. So I'm going to try not to be the annoying historian here and make too many distinctions. So in terms of what do people mean when we're talking like baseline Arianism, is that Jesus is the Word from John 1, he has a pre-existence before he became man. Arians will agree with that. So they don't believe he's like a human being to court. They think, yeah, no, he is. But they believe that the word of God, the God word, is not fully God in the same way as God the Father. And there are variations on what that looks like. The least extreme being guys who say, he's like the Father, though. And like he's got a similar essence, maybe. And then there are other guys who are the most extreme group called, these are the Eunomians or Anemoians. And they're like, he's not even like the Father at all. And he is basically a creature. Those guys are, they blow my mind. Their logic is deceptively beautiful, though. So it's actually, in my mind, that's more scary than the other one.
Yeah.
Because I could see you being like, yeah, he's homoios to the Father. He's like the Father. And so you can see that and you're like, well, no, just go the whole way, guys. Like, there's no room for a wibbly wobbly thing that's not quite God, but not quite a creature. Right. Either you're God or a creature. The fact that the Anemoians, these Eunomian guys, are like, absolutely right. You can either be God or a creature. The early Arians are wrong. He's a creature, right? You can see how that being the more logical position.
Right. They take it all the way.
It's attractive in and of itself. I find it, like, obviously, I don't find Arianism attractive at all. Like, I was reading Medieval Homily, Air Eugenia, for those who care, on the prologue to John's Gospel today. I'm like, this is beautiful. This is extraordinary theology. Why would you ever embrace Arianism?
Right.
It's just, gospel truth dripping out of it. So yeah, that's all. There's a whole variety of weird groups that you could start pulling out that we had to give weird names to. But yeah, so Arianism.
It's easier to just lump them in, be like, they were all the same, they're all wrong.
Yeah, they're all wrong. It does not matter.
Yes, that's an easier way to do history, by the way. So as a non-historian who's interested in history, I coined a new way of doing history when I was teaching a Sunday school class this past Sunday on the Incarnation and talking about Athanasius and Athanasius Contra Mundum and I said there might be dispute about exactly what was said. Anytime you get into the ancient world, what was really said, who really said it, when did it happen? Obviously, there's so many questions as far as what we might want in a modern historical sense to try to prove something happened. But as I told that story, I said, no matter what, it's just too cool not to be true. It's like some of these stories are too cool not to be true. And that's going to be my new way of looking at history as a non-historian.
Yeah. I like that approach. For example, I was going to pull some weird, St. David with the horse that can, St. David with the horse that can walk on water. Too cool not to be true, guys.
It has to be right. Oh man, I love it. Well, can you give us, obviously we can't walk through, each of these. I do want to talk, a bit more about the Seventh Council and images and iconoclasm a little bit. Being a Reformed Presbyterian podcast, we can't let you get by with just saying it was about kissing images. We have to take that on and talk about it. But before we even get there, could you just give us something that comes to mind, or multiple things would be fun too, that are things that are just interesting facts that as you teach this, these are things that you find to be interesting or fun, or the kinds of things that most people would just not know at all, that either happened at a council or something about the context, anything like that you can pull out and give us.
So one of the craziest councils is the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople, 553. It was called by everyone's second favorite or baby favorite late antique emperor Justinian, who did all sorts of cool stuff in law and conquered all sorts of things, built the Hagia Sophia that's still there in so-called Istanbul today. So-called. If you spend enough time on the right corners of Twitter, you will find Greeks who never, and I just love it, solid to these guys. But it's there. This Fifth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople. The Pope, this is one of the only councils the Pope went to. And when you read what goes on, you realize why he usually sends a representative. Outside of the fact that the councils are always in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's usually some sort of barbarian invasion going on, and so he can't leave Rome. And so he's like, I'm going to send a deacon, okay? Or like, these 3 priests and this 1 deacon, these are my guys. And they go and they do everything the Pope wants to do, and they vote for the right things and the wrong things, and they get up and they yell, I disagree, which they do sometimes, which is good fun, because all the Easterners are like, who are these Latins? What's going on, man? But yeah, so this guy, Pope Vigilius, he actually gets kidnapped by the emperor. And ends up at Constantinople at the council. And he realizes while he's there that this isn't going to go well for him. Because a lot of the people in Latin-speaking parts of the world don't like what Justinian is trying to do at the council. They don't like his policy, where they feel like he's undoing some of the stuff that Chalcedon had done, the council beforehand, because there's some people that Chalcedon reintroduced into good standing in the church, and Justinian is now condemning some of their writings, and they feel like that is weakening Chalcedon, which is the great touchstone of orthodoxy. And so like, we don't want to go there. He is also condemning some people after they're dead, and they're like, why do we do that? Like they're clearly foreseeing the condemnation of John Wycliffe at the Council of Constance. And so, obviously not. And so, so Vigilius realizes there's no way he's going to win, because now that he's there, the emperor's going to force him to do stuff that he doesn't want to do. And so first he comes out, he's like, here we go, here's my thing, all about embracing it all. Then he's like, oh, that was a bad move. So he goes and he like hides in a church, because we're in the era of sanctuary now, right? So the secular authorities, they're not coming first. So Vigilius is like hiding out in some church in Constantinople. And the emperor's like, this isn't going to fly. We need the Pope to sign off on this. And so he sends soldiers to go get him. And the Pope's like, you can't just pull me out of here. And they're like, yeah, we can. And so he grabs the altar of the church, and they keep pulling on him. And then the altar falls down on top of the Pope. Which is insane. I mean, he still goes and he still ends up having to sign off on the things he doesn't want to have to sign off on and stuff, and causes a schism with Aquileia and Milan and all of northern Italy, enter into schism with Rome for about 150 years, because he signs off on this ecumenical council, during which he pulls down this altar. So that's like, in my mind, that's one of the craziest ones. I love it. The Council of Ephesus itself is a good example of, I believe that this council expresses a philosophically coherent, biblically faithful teaching about who Jesus is. I believe that this council was a gong show.
Yeah, tell us more. So
basically, Cyril of Alexandria is out to get Nestorius. There's a combination of theology and politics involved. Cyril wanted somebody else to be Bishop of Constantinople, but Nestorius came in. But then Nestorius, as I've already said, definitely heretic. So Cyril's like, whoa, not only is he not my guy, which happens every once in a while, he is also like a raging heretic. And Nestorius is just like the whole time, he's like, no, I'm not, he's not backing down on anything. He like digs deeper in Jesus being two persons. And Cyril's like, we need to get rid of this guy through an ecumenical council. And so they get the emperor to summon this council at Ephesus. And all these guys arrive. But the Alexandrians come by sea, and so they get there first. Whereas the people who are most friendly towards Nestorius are coming from Antioch in ancient Syria, modern Turkey, and they're coming by land. And so then there's like this huge delay while they're waiting for the elderly bishop of Antioch to arrive. And Cyril's like, come on, we need to get things going. We need to get rid of Nestorius. And so he says, he says to the imperial commissioner, he gathers all of the arrived bishops, gets the commissioner to come in. He says, hey, could you just read the letter that the emperor wrote about starting the council? So the commissioner reads the letter, and Cyril says, because you read the letter, the council has now started. And the guy's like, that's not how this works. And he says, yes, it is. Reading the letter formally starts the council. He's like, but I didn't mean it. He's like, doesn't matter. So Cyril runs.
I love, by the way, how this happens in Presbyterianism, where it's just like, well, you did the thing, and now it's official. And it's like, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do that thing. I could literally see this happening.
Right? I mean, oh yeah, I'm going up to my first Anglican synod in May. I'm looking forward. To what sorts of shenanigans people are going to get up to on the floor. As long as they pass my motion, I'm okay. And and so they get this council going, and finally the guys from Antioch and everywhere from this region arrive, and they're like, Cyril started the council without us, and like they get together, start a rival council, and like first thing they do is excommunicate Cyril. Like Cyril of Alexandria is excommunicated for his uncanonical behavior, and Cyril's like, don't worry, I excommunicate John of Antioch. And Cyril never doesn't. Cyril only goes to John's council. Like he's been there from the beginning. He's like Nestorius. Nestorius is like, I'm not going to Cyril's council. That's full of my enemies. And so there's this weird canon that I don't know when it has ever like worked. It's worked to get rid of heretics, but it has also worked to get rid of Orthodox guys, where they summon you 3 times to a council following canonical precedent. If you don't go, that's like an admission of guilt, and then they can just excommunicate you. So they do that to Nestorius. They do it to a few heretics over time, but they also like did it to John Chrysostom once, right? So like, because these guys aren't dumb enough to go into a room full of their enemies, what is the point? They're going to lose either way, right? So Nestorius is like, I'm not going to Cyril's council. So, and the emperor's like, you guys are all stupid. I'm not accepting any of what you just did. And you're sort of like, well, you need the emperor's say to be able to enforce an ecumenical council. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of bishops writing paper. As anyone who has lived through the 20th and 21st century ecclesiastical disputes, you know, if you don't have an authority to actually impose what you do, you're just saying stuff and writing letters at each other, right? And so then there's this schism for 2 years after the council, until Cyril and John of Antioch come together and they write a fancy letter explaining how they actually do agree, regardless of whatever was going on in Ephesus. Here's a joint theological statement that both of these guys can get behind. So that's just my other one. Ephesus is just a total insane. It's just like,
like what a mess, what a dumpster fire.
yeah.
What is so beautiful about that, by the way, is you think about it in that terms. And I know for a lot of us, thinking about these things that have happened in history, thinking about, especially when you're talking about some of these councils that you've maybe you've heard about, that's a distant thing. It's so different. There's this, I think, idea that, man, that church was so different than our church today. And then you read things like that or hear things like that, and you think, oh, they're just like us. they're just like us.
And one of the things, and this is something that as I was doing my initial research during my PhD into the Council of Chalcedon is my specialty. And that one has all sorts of other interesting parts and the aftermath of it as well. One of the things I realized is there are all sorts of human motivations going on. And there's all sorts of human frailty going on. Like, and I'm willing to say these men are, people like Saint Cyril of Alexandria is a great saint of the church, an enormous theological mind. And I love his theology. And I still think he did a bad job in Ephesus. Right. I think that Nestorius is a heretic. Sorry, guys. Sorry to all the Nestorius stands out there. So I think these things is that the grace of God says, you know what? I need my church to maintain sound doctrine. And I'm going to use these messed up guys to get it done. These guys who might be holy in all sorts of other ways, but they might run a bad council. They might go and, hide in a church, and they might get beat up by imperial soldiers by accident. That God is going to use these guys to bring us to, like, I'm really glad I don't have to do theology before these councils.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I understand what they mean, so I can say 3 persons, 1 substance. That's God. And I'm not sitting around, like you meet some people who have zero background in the Trinity, and they're just like, so what is it? Like 3 globs that sort of sit together? I'm like, no, man, it's not it at all.
No.
And how do you build your way to the Trinity? Like the grace of God has put me in other respects, what is possibly a worse time in some ways, but a better time in others, that I can enjoy the fruits of the labors of giants like Athanasius and Cyril of Jerusalem, Cyril of Alexandria, Maximus the Confessor, all of these extraordinary theologians he blessed us with, along with all the insane stories that got us to where we are.
Yeah. Matt, that would be a perfect place to end it if I wasn't a Presbyterian. So let's talk about the Seventh Council, Second Nicaea. What's going on with the iconoclast controversy and debate? And what are some of your thoughts about the rejection of that by many of the reformers?
Yeah, so this is a good question. It's a little bit tough sometimes.
Yes.
So in 787 is the final so-called ecumenical council, meets at Nicaea. So you can see that they're actually seeing themselves in this context. And they're like, and it's number 7. We're going to cap it all off. Apparently there's actually like an 8th one later on that's about the Bishop of Constantinople and doesn't seem nearly big enough to count as an ecumenical council. 99% of the time, except for like weird history freaks, we stop at 7. Like you meet Ortho Bros, they'll probably only talk about 7. Right, so they know that they're coming to a capstone of councils with this one. And what has been going on since the early 700s is this back and forth, depending who emperor is, about the very existence and then the treatment of images of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and the saints. So one of the things that everyone should just acknowledge, there have been images in churches since at least the 3rd century. Not every church has them. Yep. It was not universal, but many churches did. Yep. And that's just like a statement of fact. It's clear if you read stories about some guys in the 4th century, they're not down with it.
Right.
But it's clear that other people have them and are okay with it. We do have, okay, catacombs don't count, but we do have religious imagery from the catacombs of like Jonah and all sorts of stuff, 3rd century images again. So Christian imagery exists. Yeah. And strangely enough, so they're also putting frescoes in synagogues. So I think for the Jewish and early Christian population, it's not, are you making an image of Moses or of our Lord? It's, what are you doing with it next?
Yeah. So
what we see for most of history, even when you start going, I do recommend, if anyone is in Rome, go check out churches from the 5th and 6th century that still have their mosaics, that didn't get like trashed by the Renaissance and the Baroque with something different. That's my late antique bias coming out there. But you know, they're probably not to a Presbyterian sensibility, but they're beautiful.
Yeah.
But based upon what little evidence we have, which is slim, people aren't walking into, well, I'm trying to think of one where the mosaics are close enough to do anything with. Like the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which has like all these mosaics of stories from the Bible in it, and being like bowing down to them. This doesn't seem to be the thing people are doing in the West, right? What you're doing, the main function, this is the famous Gregory the Great passage, and you'll find all of the Protestant apologists, we will pull them out, says that the images, they're useful for teaching and instruction, and they can enlighten us, but they're not there to be worshipped, right? This is the thing that we all pull out, and you can find earlier quotes from other guys saying basically the same thing. And you hear guys say that right up to this day. I remember I went to a church that had these, wonderful 19th century stained glass windows, and the minister said, one of the things I like about preaching here is, if my sermon turns out to be a bummer, I hope that the people who are listening, if their eyes start drifting around, they'll learn something from the images in the windows. So, there's a benefit. But what ends up happening, people start performing an act that's called proskynesis to the images. Now, proskynesis is you get down on your knees, put your hands on the floor, and touch your forehead to the floor between your hands. If you have seen Muslims praying, that's what they're doing. It is an act that is also what you do to a Persian emperor, and then starting probably with Diocletian, who's emperor. He's from like can Matthew remember his dates? 288 or 283? Oh, the shame. Anyway, he's like the guy before Constantine. He's the persecutor. Start doing it to Roman emperors too, which is like a big, people don't like that kind of thing because, you're not even a king. And this sort of thing is only to be done to the gods. Like that's what they said to Alexander when Alexander the Great wanted people to do this to him after he became Persian emperor. So this is a thing you're doing to Roman emperors, and early Christians in the imperial service didn't even do it at the start. When the emperor started asking for it, they say no, because that's an act that I reserve only for God.
Yeah.
Because it's what you do to the statue. If you go into a cult center, in every pagan temple in the ancient world, you have a statue of the god, right? So if this is the huge one of Athena in the Parthenon, and you can see bits and pieces of them that survive, and these, like, they would have been massive, massive things. And you bow down before it, and you touch your forehead to the ground. You do it to the Persian emperor, you do it to statues of gods, and you start doing it to Roman emperors during the 4th century. And so, why do you start doing it to images? This is my own theory, is that you're living in this world and where there are images of emperors, and the way you treat the image of the emperor is understood to be passed on to the emperor himself, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Yeah.
And so what is Caesar's is this painting on a piece of wood, so a lot like an icon, that will come. So for example, when there's no more emperor living in Rome, and there's no more emperor living in Italy even, a picture of the emperor gets sent from Constantinople to Rome, and it goes and actually lives in the imperial palace. And when it comes, they treat it like the emperor. They have the whole formal procession, and they have the whole big party. It doesn't give any speeches, of course, because it's just a picture. But they do all the things with it, and then they lead it up to the palace, and they put it in a special place in the palace. And if you want to riot, what do? You smash those pictures, and then the emperor might come and kill you all. Because, right? What you do to the picture, what you do to the image is passed from the archetype to the type. So if you smash an image of the emperor that says, I hate the emperor, and so the emperor says, well, I'm going to come smash the image of you, which is your body. And that almost happened in Antioch, but St. John Chrysostom managed to convince the emperor that this was a bad idea. And because he's like, well, Theodosius, you're a Baptist Christian. He thinks, why did I do that?
Yeah, what? Man, that's
Can't
really
just massacre
coming back
people anymore. So, but he learned his lesson from a previous massacre where he got excommunicated for it. So he doesn't massacre the people of Antioch. Anyway.
Listen, emperors,
right?
Kings, rulers, learn from your massacres.
Right?
Learn.
So anyway, so if we fast forward in time, we're getting images are being built and being put up in churches, whether we're talking mosaics, whether we're talking frescoes, or there's like a 6th century, the most famous one is a 6th century painted panel of our Lord from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. People have probably seen it on the internet. And so these are coming around, and people are to start treating them in the same way that they would the image of the emperor on those grounds, right? This is a culturally understood thing. If I'm bowing down to the image, I'm not worshiping the wood. I'm not worshiping the encosta. I'm not worshiping the gold leaf. I'm worshiping Jesus Christ, who is represented by it. So the honor I give to the icon is passed from the icon to Jesus. So that is, like, in a nutshell, what people start doing.
Comes from.
Yeah. And we're not 100% sure why the emperor does this, but in the 720s, 730s, he decides that he's not going to do it anymore, and nobody's going to do it anymore. And so they start smashing all of the images within the imperial boundaries, which is why our earliest icons come from places like St. Catherine's or Rome, because they're outside the reach of the imperial. Although technically Rome is part of the empire, that's a technicality. Rome is its own independent thing at this point.
Right.
And so then we have, if you were to go to Constantinople today, go to Hagia Sophia, go to Hagia Sophia, and you see those beautiful mosaics, those are from the 1200s, because whatever was there before was destroyed. And actually, Justinian's original was there were no figural images on it in the 6th century. There were no icons in the original mosaics. But they start going whole hog for images after the controversy. So you have this, and so it's just gone. Even non-worship images get destroyed. right? So there's an image in the imperial palace is one of the first ones to go down. So it's not one that anyone is actually offering any proskyneses to, right? People aren't on their way into the palace and bowing down to it. If they are, they're weirdos, right? It's the passage into, like, it's a thoroughfare, right? But it gets destroyed. So anything within any church at this point in history, what we have is the empire. Asia Minor, Turkey, and like northern Syria, and Greece and the Balkans is pretty much all that is left of the empire. All of those images get destroyed, mostly. Probably there are a few ones that seem to be a bit older in places like Thessalonica, and I don't know how those survive, but most of them are gone and destroyed. And so then there's a back and forth as you go. A new emperor will come along who's like, no, I love the images, and then another guy's like, no, the images are bad. And so this is sort of, you have this tussle until 787 is when they have this council. And it's actually a response. There's a prior council to it that's like the pro-iconoclast council. They're like, yeah, smashing images is great. We're going to have an ecumenical council to show people what's what. The Pope's response to that is to start putting mosaics everywhere in the city of Rome. So you can sort of see it doesn't get the wide support it was looking for. So what I like, if you go, there's a beautiful church, Santa Maria Antiqua, in the Forum of Rome. It's just full of frescoes, and it was erected during the iconoclastic controversy in the East. Sort of the Pope saying, well, I don't know, looks like I could do this. And he redid St. Peter's at the same time. Every once in a while, the Pope redoes St. Peter's, so we'll see what happens in 500 years when the current St. Peter's is a millennium old. So they just are going back and forth. And outside the empire, though, so here's the guy that we need to know, if you're thinking about the theology at 787, is John of Damascus. And what's interesting is if you are like, I'm down with patristic dogma and I'm down with the fathers, his work on the Orthodox faith, even a Presbyterian can go for it, right? So this is why for me, the whole icons thing, some guys go so hard. I'm like, you're going so hard, John of Damascus comes out a heretic, and I can't go there with you. Which maybe you're, I don't know how hard reformed the listeners are.
It is. We have a weird mix of people that listen to this podcast. It leans very iconoclast, but I would not say that that's the case across the board. I mean, we have a weirdly wide audience of people, and so it comes from all over.
You do reaction videos to Mark Driscoll, so you're gonna draw.
That's literally why. That is why, Matt. Man, there's so much we can keep talking about on this. We're gonna keep talking a little bit, but we've got pretty long. I want you to give a handoff and tell people about the class that you're going to be teaching, how to sign up. I want you to tell people where to find you online. If I could, by the way, I would be signing up for this class. I literally can't. I'd be in so much trouble with my church, with my wife, if I tried to take on anything else right now. And so I can't, but I seriously look forward to the day that I can do this sort of thing. But please tell us where we can find more.
All right. So this class is the Seven Ecumenical Councils in Historical Context. And I would just like to say, if you do classical Protestant theology, you can definitely sign off on councils 1 through 6. So it's definitely worth knowing them. And then because icons are such a big thing in the Reformation, understanding the seventh is also super important for all of us. There are guys like me who are a bit wiggly, I admit, about icons because I like them as pieces of art, right? I just don't know about bowing down to them. Anyway, so I hope that doesn't ruin it for anyone. Please take the course and fight with me about icons, okay?
That's right.
If you're super hard reformed, I want you in my class, actually. And I want you to come up with your best arguments against icons when we do that lecture. But it's mostly, though, historical context. So there's also a sense in which you can come not knowing any of this. Maybe you're like half-hearted on some of the doctrine. And what I'm going to give you is a major theologian for each council. So like these guys are masters. So Athanasius, who Pastor Michael loves, rightly so. Did you name one of your kids after him?
Yeah. My fourth son, third son, but fourth child has the middle name Athanasius. But I try to get the first name, but it's probably wise that we didn't get that one.
Yeah, it's some names just. So we've got him, and then you've got Gregory of Nazianzus, who gives one of the best, succinct Doctrines of the Trinity, coming up for the next one. And then you've got Cyril of Alexandria, who, as I say, an extraordinarily wonderful theologian, very clear thinker. And then Pope Leo the Great, who was the subject of my PhD dissertation. I don't like his stuff about the papacy because I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I love his stuff about Christology, right? So this is one of the things we also get into in patristics is you're not going to agree with them on everything. I had a Presbyterian friend who said one of the nice things is being able to fight with the church fathers sometimes, right?
Yes.
Whereas you feel like, are the Orthodox able to do that? I don't know.
Right.
I don't want to anger the
we'll
Ortho Bros. Don't want to anger the Ortho Bros. I'm friends with some of them. And but yes, and then just basically right through the last one of the greatest theologians of the patristic era, Maximus the Confessor, for the sort of Sixth Council, a name everyone should know, who I feel like he takes the work of Athanasius and then some of the mystical theology stuff that I get into when I do Desert Fathers, and he brings it together and unites it. And I think it's just like this magnificent, it's a sort of thing you can do because you've been building on the work of others, that God blessed the church with these councils. And so you can start thinking about a new question, because you're not spending, poor Athanasius, amazing, brilliant theologian, great exegete, solid pastor, spends his whole time fighting as to whether Jesus is God or not.
Yeah, right.
Like when you start looking at guys in the next generations who are like, that's settled. Let's start thinking about what that means next. You can really see why these councils were a means for God to bless the church. And so that's what you're going to get. You're going to get conciliar definitions. You're going to read some canons. You can see if you agree with me about the canons of Nicaea as to whether they're as useful as I think they are. And you're going to be reading dogmatic statements, canons, and then a major theologian for each council to sort of get it in its context. And I'm going to give you all the other stuff about like Roman emperors and what the Roman imperial policies are going on. You don't have to sort of do that. I have all that. Mostly that's up here. Sometimes I forget a name or two. I have notes for the class.
Yes. Yeah, that's awesome. And I'd recommend, and we'll find, I need to get a link from you
Yes.
for the sign up, and we'll put it in the show notes that people have that. They can find you on Twitter. They can find you anywhere else you want to point people.
So I'm getting back into blogging a bit with my old WordPress account, which is the pocketscroll.wordpress.com. I'm starting to occasionally cross-post posts from that through Substack, but I'm not 100% sure about these siloed environments like Substack and Twitter and how that you can't talk to each other across
right.
platforms anymore. It's annoying. Yeah. So I'll probably continue cross-posting because I still have my enormous quantity of 600 WordPress followers. And so those are the main places you can find me. And then I have a YouTube, Matt Classics, that I'm also in the business of getting up and running again. But I tend to cross-post everything. So, I mean, the algorithm will hide the cross-posting. If I just post a YouTube link on Twitter, you might not find it. Yep. But it will. I do put it there. So.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much. We're going to have a little more fun still, and that will probably be released maybe only to the patrons. But thank you for coming on. This was great. And guys, take the course if you're able. And even if not, go subscribe on YouTube or follow on Twitter so that you know where else to find some of this stuff from Matt.
You heard Michael. Go follow the links, find the course, and as always subscribe and share this show with everyone you know, and check out the Patreon for more S-less.